Hello and welcome to another YouTube video. In this one we're discussing how to prime with an airbrush. So straight into it, the first thing you're going to need is a surface primer, some sort of primer. Because we're not going to be using a rattle can, we need to use an airbrush primer. There are lots of different manufacturers out there that make airbrush primers. AK Interactive, the one I'm using there is from Vallejo. Now the next thing you're going to need is your miniature. So your miniature ought to be assembled, cleaned up, based and ready to go. The third thing you're going to need is an airbrush. I'm using a H&S Ultra. It's a great entry-level airbrush. Alongside the compressor, those are the three things you really need. Now, when priming with an airbrush, I generally set my compressor to a little bit higher than I would do if I was airbrushing a base coat. So anywhere from 30 to 35 psi should do nicely. And before I even start to prime, the first thing I'm going to do is make sure my airbrush is connected properly to my compressor. I always leave the needle slightly unscrewed, and that way I know there's no pressure on the nozzle while my airbrush isn't being used. Small precaution, but I like to do it. So right now you can see that I was just checking my airbrush, connecting the hose to the airbrush and blowing some air through just to make sure everything was working nicely. I'm making sure that I shake the surface primer really well. This is an acrylic surface primer. It's a polyurethane surface primer, and they really need to be shook properly to make sure that they're mixed well. You can also see I've got a small piece of tissue there just so I can spray any excess onto the tissue to make sure that my airbrush spray is good. And once I've shook the mix, I'm not going to dilute my airbrush primer. I've tried it in the past, I didn't have great results, so I like to spray it on neat, so to speak. Now, before I actually put the primer into the airbrush to spray it through, I always like to put in a little bit of water. That way the water will just act as a lubricant for the airbrush before anything else goes through it, because I've not used the airbrush for a while. So you just need to put in a couple of drops of water and then just spray that through your airbrush onto the small paper towel to make sure that your airbrush is spraying well and it's had some liquid go through it. Once we've done that, next up we put a few drops of our airbrush primer into the airbrush. I used about 4 drops here. You don't need loads, I'm only showing you how to airbrush on a single miniature. So once our airbrush primer is inside the airbrush, as you can see there, I sprayed a little bit of the primer onto the tissue just to make sure that it was spraying well and had a consistency in PSI that I was happy with. And then you can just start to spray in short bursts all over your miniature. I start with the base. I like doing like a top-down angle first, then I'll work my way around the miniature, rotating it on the piece of paper. If you're spraying lots of miniatures at the same time, you can always do this in batch painting. Batch groups. Maybe stick 4 or 5 miniatures to a piece of cardboard just so you can get the angle underneath them all relatively easy. Or easily, I should say. Sorry. Bad English there. I then rotate the miniature. So I've now done a pass from the top, rotating around in a 360-degree motion. I'll rotate the miniature so I can get all the parts underneath from the bottom angle that I may have missed from the top angle. And I'll just work my way across the miniature, spraying a nice even coat. As I'm doing this, I'm also just depressing the airbrush trigger and not pulling back so I don't get any paint come through the airbrush. It's just air, and that way I'm helping to dry the primer to make sure that it's going on smoothly and I'm not spraying splodges of wet paint onto wet paint. Periodically you'll notice that I go back to that piece of tissue, spray, I do a large pull back on the trigger just to clear any blockages in the airbrush onto the tissue, and then I resume spraying on my miniature. Once I'm happy with how it's looking there, I'm just double checking to make sure I've not missed any parts. and then I'll go back if I have, just spray a few more passes on those parts that I think need a little bit extra coverage, and then that's that. Airbrush priming really is that easy. It's so much easier to do than just taking a rattle can and having to worry about humidity, air temperature outside, wind blowing. It's really straightforward. It's a very controlled type of priming method. Now, one thing about acrylic polyurethane primers that you should know is they do take about 24 hours to fully cure. Sometimes they can take a little bit longer. I know a lot of YouTubers out there will prime, blast it with a hairdryer just to speed things up, and you can paint on top of primer if you do that, but generally speaking, for best results, you want to make sure that you're leaving it for 24 hours to cure. Now, once I've finished priming, you can see that I just used a little bit of airbrush cleaner. Again, this is by Vallejo, and I'm taking a Q-tip or a cotton bud, as it's also known, mixing the remaining primer inside the airbrush with that airbrush cleaner just to unclog any bits that have stuck to the inside of the airbrush. Place the little cotton bud onto a tissue, and then I take my airbrush cleaning spray pot. Again, this is by Sparmax. They're the manufacturer that make my compressor as well. I love Sparmax, fantastic company. I've used them for about 10 years now. I've just got a new compressor from them. Brilliant stuff. So I now drain the airbrush cleaner into that cleaning spray pot. And the reason we're using a cleaning spray pot is so that you don't get loads of overspray and fumes in your working area. Now, something I didn't show on this video is I'm also using a 3M respirator. So because I'm spraying in a closed room, I don't have any windows open or anything like that. It's very hot over here where I live. I'm using a full face, full cover 3M organic vapor mask. Now, lots of people don't use masks when they airbrush because they don't think acrylic paints are dangerous, but if you're atomizing anything, it's not great to breathe that stuff in. So after spraying the cleaner through the airbrush, the next step is to disassemble the airbrush and give it a quick clean. It's always worth doing this. You can just use the excess airbrush cleaner that's still on the cotton bud to wipe off the airbrush cup to make sure that nothing dries there and clogs up your airbrush at a later date. I'll then unscrew the airbrush, unscrew the nut that keeps the needle in place and tight. I'll unscrew the nozzle at the front, and then I just slide the nozzle carefully off and take it apart from the little cap that keeps it in place. Next, I need to slide my needle out of the airbrush. It's very important that you slide it through the airbrush and not backwards. That way you don't get any paint pulled up through the body of the airbrush. You don't want paint drying inside your airbrush. It'll be a bitch to clean. Next thing that you need to do is take that same cotton swab that has the airbrush cleaner solution still on it and gently wipe off the paint that's on your airbrush needle. Be careful that you don't bring the cotton swab backwards and you're only going off the edge of the needle so you don't catch the end of it and bend it. Clean out the little nozzle cap and then gently dab the end of the nozzle as well with that same solution, just to loosen up any paint that might be dried inside there. Be very, very careful with the nozzle and the needle, the tip of the needle. They're very easy to damage, and if you damage them, you will need to buy a new one. Next thing I do is I take the clean end of the cotton swab and give a wipe of the front of the airbrush and also the part that the cap enters and connects to. That way I soak up any excess dried paint there. You can see it's come out black, so there was a bit of paint in there. And then after I've done all of that, the next thing to do is to continue to clean the needle. So although we've wiped it with the cotton swab and got the majority of paint off, you'll see that in this next section, I drop a little bit of airbrush cleaner onto a clean piece of kitchen towel. And then I'll drag the needle through that wet patch on the kitchen towel. And that's really going to wipe off the last bits of paint. And so the needle looks clean, but you'll see that as I pull it through here and I twist and rotate it backwards as I do so, I'll do it a couple of times. You can see there's some black residue of primer that was still left on that needle. So it's really important to give your needle a good clean. Takes a few extra minutes at the end of each painting session. I like to strip my airbrush every single time I use it, because that way I maintain it and make sure that I don't get any blockages. I've had some of my airbrushes now for over 10 years and they still spray really, really well. If you maintain your gear, if you buy good quality stuff, as long as you can afford it, get the best things you can afford, and then you look after them and you take care of them, then that's really important, because that way they will last you for long periods of time. I'm doing the same thing to the nut there as well, and you can see that I'm now screwing the nozzle nut back onto the airbrush, and I'm depressing the trigger as I put the needle back into the airbrush there. The reason I depress the trigger is to make sure that the airbrush needle doesn't get caught on anything as I put it back together. Once I've screwed the airbrush and completed the build again, I'll put a few bits of thinner into the airbrush and just run that, cleaner into the airbrush, and then just run that through the airbrush again into my spray pot, just to clean out any last bits, to make sure that the airbrush is well and truly cleaned. There we go, that's all done. Last but not least, I'll take some water and then flush the airbrush with some water. This way my airbrush is nice and clean, ready for my next session. That's about it, really. The last thing you're going to see me do once the water's gone through is I always, like I said at the start of the video, I always leave my airbrush needle slightly unscrewed and retracted, so that it's not pushed up tight against the end of the nozzle continuously. So when not in use, you'll see me unscrew the back end of the airbrush now, after disconnecting it from the air pipe, of course, and just loosen that needle slightly. There we go. And that's ready to be stored. And that way I know my airbrush is good. So, long-winded process probably for a lot of people to strip an airbrush and clean it every time they use it. Some people might say that that's excessive. Some people might say that I could go further with the cleaning. For me, that works, and it doesn't take too long to do. So it's not too bad of a process. Get rid of your dirty tissues, clean your workspace up, and you're pretty much good to go. So I hope you enjoyed that little video. That's how I prime indoors when I need to prime indoors. Maybe you can give me a comment and let me know how or what you want to see in the next video. That's your primed miniature with an airbrush. What colour should I paint him up? What type of chapter should I paint him up as? Maybe an Imperial Fist? Maybe an Alpha Legion? Let me know. Maybe I'll do it. Thank you so much, and thanks for watching.